Which public universities are in and which public universities are out amongst my student and parent population? That is the topic of today's video. My name is Craig Meister. I'm a college admissions coach. You can learn more about me and how you can work with me one-on-one throughout the entire college admissions process on my website, which is collegemeister.com. And if you're interested in learning about whether or not you are or your student is on track for selective college admission in the United States of America, I encourage you to go to my new free 3-minute assessment at areyouontracktogetin.com. Again, that's areyouontracktogetin.com. Once you complete that assessment, your results will be emailed to you right away, and they will help you clarify whether you are or your student is on track for selective college admission in the United States of America. So I work with families from around the world, and I see a lot of different value systems and priorities in the students and parents with whom I work. But I will say that over the last 4 years or so, I've seen two very notable trends in the students and parents with whom I work. Number one trend is, as it relates to public universities in particular, American students and parents with whom I work are much more open-minded to sending their students to public universities in the southeast of the United States. There's no question that when I started doing this 18 years ago, when I told a Maryland family or a New York family or a Pennsylvania family that I think Texas A&M would be a really good fit for your child, or University of Alabama would be a really good fit for your child, and in some cases, University of Miami would be a really good fit for your child, or University of South Carolina would be a really good fit for your child, or have you ever considered Clemson? Many families, particularly in the Northeast and on the West Coast, would look at me like I had just insulted their long passed away grandfather. And that would be very hurtful, of course. It looked like I really hurt their feelings. And that is no longer the case. So I would say that either Americans are just getting much more open-minded to different parts of the country, writ large overall, or the Southeast has, in particular, shed a lot of the negative stereotypes or connotations that West Coast individuals and Northeastern residents used to associate with the Southeast. The other flip side of this is that in my conversations with parents in particular, and students are often finding a harder time sort of verbalizing it, but sort of they're saying the same thing. And of course, they're growing up in the households of their parent or parents. So they're sort of parroting oftentimes what their value systems, the value systems they've learned to grow up in. But what I'm gleaning from students and parents is that basically, increasingly, many students and parents, regardless of their political affiliation, are looking at the public and private institutions that are best known, that are usually associated with the Northeast and the West Coast. And they are looking at them and seeing basically indoctrination centers or activism centers, more than they're looking at them as public universities with the full panoply of extracurricular opportunities available to undergraduate students. And so they want, quote unquote, a normal college experience for their students. What they associate with normal is like what existed in sort of like the 1980s or 90s. They see what appears to be the most normal or recognizable undergraduate experience at public universities in the South or Southeast of the United States. And they see what they deem to be, quote unquote, the most abnormal undergraduate experience at particular institutions, particularly public universities in California and on the West Coast, but also at an increasing number of flagship land-grant public universities and secondary public institutions in the, not secondary as in secondary education, but sort of second tier, not the land-grant publics, but sort of the other publics, the more regional colleges and universities in the Northeast. They're seeing stories, headlines almost once, if not twice, if not 3 times a week about wild stories related to politics, related to activism, related to new policies on different campuses, And they're looking at their children and they're looking at these headlines and they're thinking, it seems like everything is now political at these institutions in the Northeast and on the West Coast. And therefore, it's like through process of elimination, it appears to many, and this is not something I have offered, they have offered to me, that the Southeastern schools seem to be a more laid back version of what's happening elsewhere in this country and sort of a more traditional college experience. If my son wants to go into a fraternity and be president of the fraternity by the end of his 4-year experience, but otherwise just go to class, enjoy himself, relax, meet people, socialize, that's like okay to do at a Southern university in many parents' minds. Same thing with a daughter wanting to go into a sorority. If they want to go into environmental activism on campus, there are clubs for that too. If they want to get involved in the Democrat club or the Republican club or on campus, they can do that too. But no one particular group seems to dominate the school in a way that the headlines are making parents and students believe particular political activists have sort of taken over particular colleges and universities, particularly public colleges and universities, but I would argue also private colleges and universities in the Northeast and also West Coast of the United States. Now, whether or not these parents are wholly right is, of course, up for debate. And I would argue that you can have extreme political actors on any college campus in the United States. And you can also find relative pockets of normalcy at almost any college or university in the United States. But the overall accumulation of headlines over the recent last 3 to 4 years has been pretty negative toward public and private, but I'm talking today about public universities in the Northeast and on the West Coast. So what has this meant for my student and parent population? And again, I recognize that my student and parent population is not representative of the overall American population. I also have international students and parents who I will talk about in a moment with another trend. But for my American students and parents, I will say I think they represent all sort of ideological perspectives. I do have liberal parents and students. I also have conservative parents and students. I also have moderate parents and students as they self-describe themselves in my intake form. The reason I ask this, by the way, is so I get a sense of the family's value system when I help them develop a college list. And so I do ask that in my game plan intake form. But from all comers, what I am noticing is that schools like University of New Hampshire, UConn, the SUNY schools, these are schools that Rutgers are less and less in demand with my student and parent population. Now, again, this is a small cloister of students and parents. I want to make that very clear. UConn, for instance, I know had more applications recently than ever before. So clearly, my student parent population is not representative of the overall reality because UConn is doing great. Now, that may have something to do with sports teams. That may have something to do with, the cost of tuition for the very well-educated Connecticut population by going out of state. And a lot of the Connecticut residents want to stay in state. But there's a lot of reasons behind that. But again, in my student and parent population, schools like Clemson, schools like University of South Carolina, schools like Alabama, schools like University of Miami and Elon and Davidson. These are all colleges that were harder sells for me 15, 18 years ago when I was working with families, particularly with families on the West Coast and the Northeast of the United States. These parent populations now and student parent populations are very much open-minded to the Southeast in ways that they were not before. And with many of these families and students, because they now know more individuals who may be living in the Southeast or who've sent their own children to the Southeast in previous years, the comfort level is increasing. And this goes back to something I mentioned in a previous video, which is a lot of our decision-making, whether we want to admit it or not, or whether we realize it or not, is pretty narrow-minded and or provincial in the sense that we go with what we know or feel comfortable with or someone we trust has done themselves. And so if you know increasingly people are living in the Southeast and they're succeeding in the Southeast and they're actually thriving maybe in the Southeast, even if you still live in San Francisco or you still live in Boston and you're going to stay there, you maybe didn't know as many people in the Southeast 10, 15, 20 years ago. And you had old stereotypes in your mind about this region. And you may have looked down your nose even at the Southeast. And now that's not nearly as the case as it used to be. I think this has also coincided with remote work, and maybe individuals are working with people from a diversity of regions in the country. And so they see that people are people everywhere. And regional distinctions are sort of breaking down in many ways. And that has been, I think, a boon in my student and parent population for colleges in the Southeast, all of which could be great fits for students from around the world. But again, for many years, I was having a real hard time. It was a very tough sell for my American families, particularly from the upper Midwest, from the Northeast and the West Coast, to get them to look in the Southeast. Now, I will be very honest. There are very bad colleges in the Southeast too. There are very bad colleges in the Northeast and the West Coast. And when I say bad, I mean like poor instruction, not just poor rankings, but poor instruction, poor student quality of life, poor career services. That's what I'm talking about when I use the word bad. That's a very strong word. There, you can find good colleges and bad colleges everywhere in the United States. But for whatever reason, for many years, lots of families were just very hesitant to look at the Southeast. That is no longer the case. And because the Southeast is booming in population and many more people are moving to the Southeast, both from the United States, but just overall the population of that region of the country is growing, there is something to be said for the economic and the ROI factor playing here as well in the minds of students and parents. So whereas Rutgers and the SUNY schools and UConn, and to some extent even UMass, and definitely University of New Hampshire, and to some extent Vermont, are less popular than ever in my student population, schools, like I said, Clemson and Davidson and Elon and Wake Forest and Miami, and as I mentioned, Alabama and Texas A&M. These are schools that if I had mentioned to a Maryland family or a New York family in 2007, I would get the look of death in the eye from some of these parents. Lovely people, by the way, but they just couldn't even fathom the idea of sending their child from the Upper East Side to Texas A&M or from Potomac, Maryland to Tuscaloosa. But now there is definitely an open-mindedness. Now, again, there are some bridges that are still too far. Whether or not they should be, again, this is a very subjective process. I don't even know if I should name them, but like there are one or two colleges that are still a bridge too far for some. But overall, there is a lot of open-mindedness from my American students and parents about the Southeast. I think that's wonderful. I think students should cast a wide net, particularly early on when they're developing their list in 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade. And that's a good thing. That's really good. Because there's all different types of opportunities. So again, the overall messaging behind this is that the colleges appear to be like colleges across the entire United States were in the 1980s and 90s, which is a diversity of opportunities inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And the feeling, at least, is that these are not college campuses that are dominated by political activism and politics overall, and that students can be whoever they want to be, and not any one clique of students runs the show as in such a dominant manner as what they're seeing may be happening at a school like UC Berkeley or a school like Rutgers and so forth. All right, so that's sort of trend number one in my student and parent population. The other trend is that I've noticed with my international students and parents, which is try as I might to get them to look at colleges and universities in the Midwest and the South. The vast majority of international students and parents are still chasing the shiny objects and the rankings. And I think this has to do with obviously less familiarity with the United States than with their own home countries. And so looking from afar, they're more reliant potentially on rankings lists and less aware of the diversity of regions in the United States, the diversity of people in the United States, and the fact that you can find positive experiences in all 50 states. And so what I'm seeing from such individuals, and also from a very rational perspective because of direct flights and other reasons, many of my international students and parents, even though this trend toward the Southeast is definitely occurring, especially with safeties and possibles on my students list, for my American students and parents, what I'm seeing for my international students and parents is that they want to go big or go home. And going big or going home in their mind is relying on the well-known, well-established names that have been popular in their home countries for decades. And so, ironically, schools like UMass, schools like, public institutions like Michigan and Wisconsin, and in the Northeast, schools even like Vermont are much more popular than schools like Alabama, Arizona, even if potentially the schools that I just mentioned at the end of that part of my little commentary may be better fits for their students in a lot of ways. The region is still causing a lot of parents and students to cross colleges off their list. Whereas my American students are very open-minded now to almost the entire continuous 48 states in the United States. The international students with whom I work are still really, and if anything, more than ever, interested in the Boston area, the New York area, the Chicago area, and the Bay Area and the Los Angeles area of California. So that's, I think, a shame, because what I am seeing also as a trend is increasingly it's very hard for students to get into colleges in those metropolitan areas if they're coming from abroad, because so many international students, like a pileup. I mean, Northeastern, for instance, is a great example. I don't talk about Northeastern much, and I will continue to not talk about Northeastern much for a lot of reasons. But let's talk about Northeastern today. This is a private school, actually, today. I'm talking about, I'm doing a little tangent. But Northeastern University has so many international students interested in it purely because it is in Boston. That's it. It's not because of the co-op program, which a lot of people could be attracted to, and there's a lot of reason potentially to be interested in the co-op program. It is because it is in Boston. Period. End of story. The end. That is actually so much the case that UMass Amherst and UMass Boston both benefit from that overflow of international interest in Boston as well. So much so, I'm using Northeastern as an example. I have seen students in recent years get rejected from Northeastern. I know we're talking about private school and this whole video is about publics, but I want to talk about this for a second. I have seen international students, full pay international students, get rejected from Northeastern in recent years, who have gotten into schools like Rice, schools like WashU, schools like Northwestern, schools like Vanderbilt. And you might as well give me a barf bag when that happens. I am appalled by it in every which way. It's too much for me to handle. But it also pains me because those schools, Rice, WashU, Northwestern even, which is in the Chicago metropolitan area, but it's not right in Chicago, it's just to the north. Vanderbilt, obviously Nashville is an up-and-coming city, are amazing institutions and have really good personalized attention, amazing intellects in terms of the professor population and the student population. To think that Northeastern is rejecting students getting to those schools, it's just a travesty of justice. There are so many words I could use, but I think travesty is the best word I could use. But that's also playing out in terms of even public universities, institutions in those very in-demand regions. So I want to make very clear, again, I encourage all students to look across the entire upper 48, as they used to say. Sure, look at Alaska and Hawaii too, but that is a further flight for many in the United States and from abroad, depending on where you're coming from abroad. Though some of my Asian clients, of course, it's actually faster to get to Hawaii or Alaska. But For my European and South American clients, I understand what's up with that. But the point being, the trend I'm seeing in international is that as things get wilder politically in the United States, and as a lot of other social economic forces are at play in their own home countries, if they're going to come to the United States, they want to go for what they deem to be a sure thing. And they associate a sure thing with a school that has been well regarded in their home country for decades. And so it's very ironic. We're sort of seeing a bifurcation. The international families are relying more than ever on sort of reputation from the past, whereas the American families are more willing to cast aside institutions that were well populated by maybe even members of their own family in the past, because they are now associating such institutions with some characteristics that they no longer feel like should be a part of the undergraduate experience, particularly for those families, regardless of their political persuasion, who want their kids to just have, quote unquote, that normal college experience, or that I should use the word traditional college experience, where they can find themselves. They don't have to feel pressured by professors or peers to be any way that they don't want them to be, or they may not organically develop into. They can find themselves over 4 years as a professional, as a student, as a person. They see that as happening more likely at Southern public universities increasingly, and even Southern private universities. But this video was officially about publics, so that's why I want to sort of focus it on the publics. Now, this is interesting. We'll see if this continues. And as I mentioned, sort of the whole idea related to knowing people who are comfortable there and who've succeeded there definitely plays an undergirding role in all of this. And frankly, international families have far less experience with a school like Ole Miss or a school like, Davidson than they would at schools like BU or NYU. So let's use some publics, even Rutgers or UMass. And on the West Coast, schools like UC Berkeley or UCLA or even UC San Diego. These are flashpoint schools, well-known marquee schools that are well recognized in their home countries. That's important that the families and the students want to go back to their home countries. The families want their kids to come back and the students want to come back. You can understand why relying on reputation, even if that reputation is just existing now in fumes, as it's not the same place it was. I mean, this is true, of course, across the board. Any institution, it may have had a great reputation 5 years ago. Maybe it has a new president now. Maybe they put in a new provost, and the whole school's a different school. It looks the same. The buildings are the same, but overall, ideologically or in terms of the focus of the people in charge, it's a whole different school. That has become very obvious in recent months and years to Americans that are really paying attention. But it's not so clear yet, I think, to international families. And so this is an education process. When I work with students and families, I really try to get to know the students and the families' value systems and priorities so that I can recommend a good list of schools for those students and parents. Because for some families, this matters a lot, everything we talked about today. For other families, it doesn't matter at all. They have very specific goals in mind. And, I try to help students and parents develop lists that are in alignment with that family's goals. The end. That is it. Now, of course, I can, advise some other things for them to consider. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to college again. The students are the ones going to college. I also remind the parents that they're not going to college again. It's their students who are going to college again. So you want to be obviously very respectful of the parents or grandparents if they're paying the bills. But ultimately, I also like to remind those paying the bills that it's the student who's going. And so if there is some distance between what the parent or parents want and what the student wants, I do try to bring this parent or parents along to sort of at least listen to, respect what the student wants, and recognize that if you put a student somewhere he or she doesn't want to be, that could really boomerang back in a bad way over the short, medium, and long term, to say the least. I've seen that happen too, and you don't want that to happen. So that's it. Public university trends. I'm so happy that more Americans are considering the Southeast. Now, this is not to say that Rutgers and UMass Amherst and UConn are not great fit schools for the right student. But for my student population, those are less in favor than ever before. And schools like Clemson, University of South Carolina, really have impressed college-going visitors of my student and parent population in recent years. So I do want to share that information with you. Take it for what it is worth, which is just one man's observations. And you yourself should, of course, try to start visiting virtually and in person as soon as you possibly can to see if you are attracted to Southeastern universities or they are not the right fit for you. And either way, it's okay because everyone is different. And that's what makes the world go round, right? All right. So until next time, I want to say to you, my name is Craig Meister. If you enjoy this video, please go to my website, which is collegemeister.com, where you can learn more about me and how you can maybe work with me throughout or even for just part of the college admissions process as you transition from high school to college or university. And then also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and also consider subscribing to my channel. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, and most importantly, stay stress-free throughout the entire college admissions